Welcome to Drowseworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the Halifax Explosion, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about the single largest man-made explosion before the atomic age. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Maybe turn down the lights, let the room settle into comfortable darkness. Perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle, constant hum. Get comfortable. We're about to explore a moment when an entire city learned just how fragile civilization really is. December 6th, 1917, Halifax, Nova Scotia. You wake up in your modest home on the north end of the city, the part closest to the harbour. It's a Thursday morning, and the winter cold seeps through every crack in the walls, despite your best efforts to seal them. The temperature hovers just below freezing, and your breath makes little clouds in the dim morning light. You're a dock worker, one of thousands who keep this crucial wartime port running, and today seems like it will be just another day of back-breaking labor in service of a war being fought an ocean away. But it won't be just another day. In less than 3 hours, you'll be dead. Or worse, you'll be one of the survivors, wandering through a landscape so utterly transformed by violence that you'll spend the rest of your life trying to convince people that what you saw was real. Let's understand what Halifax was in 1917, because to truly grasp the magnitude of what happened here, you need to understand what was lost. Halifax wasn't just any port city. In the third winter of the Great War, it had become one of the most strategically important locations in the entire British Empire. This was where convoys assembled before making the dangerous Atlantic crossing to Britain, running the gauntlet of German U-boats that prowled those waters like wolves. The population had swollen dramatically since the war began. What had been a city of perhaps 50,000 souls now teemed with over 65,000 people, maybe more. Nobody was keeping exact count anymore. There were soldiers everywhere, waiting for transport to Europe. Sailors from a dozen nations crowded the taverns and boarding houses. Workers had flooded in from across Canada and beyond, drawn by good wages and the promise of steady employment. Housing was scarce, rents were outrageous, and people packed themselves into whatever shelter they could find. You live in Richmond, the neighborhood that sprawls across the northern part of the Halifax Peninsula. It's a working-class area, industrial and practical, without pretension. The streets are lined with wooden houses, most of them painted in faded colors that were probably cheerful once, but now just look weathered by salt air and time. There are factories here, a sugar refinery, the Acadia Sugar Refinery to be precise, sitting right on the waterfront. There are railway yards where the intercolonial railway sorts and assembles the endless trains that feed the port. There's the Richmond Printing Company, several schools, including the Protestant Orphanage and the Richmond School, churches, small shops, and the dense network of homes where families try to maintain some semblance of normal life while the world tears itself apart. Your morning routine is simple because it has to be. Water from the kitchen pump, ice cold and shocking, splashed on your face. The stove needs stoking, coal dust on your hands before you've even had breakfast. Your wife is already up, has been for an hour, preparing what food you have. Oatmeal, probably. Bread, if you're lucky. Tea, weak and oversteeped because tea is expensive now. Everything is expensive now, and you make it stretch as far as it will go. The children need to be readied for school. Your daughter, 9 years old, complains about the cold. Your son, 7, is more interested in the ships in the harbour than in his breakfast. He wants to know about the big vessels, asks you questions you can't always answer. Is that one going to France? Will it have to fight submarines? Could you see a submarine if one came into the harbor? You don't tell him that yes, submarines could theoretically enter the harbor, that there are anti-submarine nets and patrol boats for exactly that reason, that the war everyone thought would be over by Christmas 3 years ago has turned into a grinding nightmare of industrialized slaughter. You just tell him to eat his breakfast and get ready for school. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters and let me know in the comments where you are checking in from today. Now, let's get back to Halifax in those final hours. The walk to the docks takes you through streets you know like the lines on your own palm. Past the Hillis foundry, where they make iron castings and the air always smells like metal and coal smoke. Past neighbors' homes, and you exchange nods with men heading to their own jobs, women already returning from early morning errands. Everyone moves with purpose. This is a city at work, a city in service to something larger than itself. The harbor dominates everything. The Narrows, that slim channel connecting the upper harbor to the outer Bedford Basin, is always crowded with traffic. Ships coming and going, tugboats fussing around larger vessels like sheepdogs herding enormous steel sheep. The dockyards are a constant symphony of industrial noise. Metal on metal, shouting voices, steam whistles, cranes creaking as they swing cargo through the air. You work as a longshoreman, loading and unloading the endless stream of supplies that flow through this port. It's brutal work, heavy lifting in all weather, long hours, dangerous conditions. Men fall, get crushed between cargo and ship hulls, lose fingers, or worse, to snapping cables and shifting loads. But it pays, and in wartime, that's enough. The ships you work on carry everything a modern army needs. Ammunition, obviously, thousands upon thousands of tons of shells and bullets and explosives. Food in vast quantities. Uniforms and boots and tents. Medicine, coal, steel, timber, horses. Because the war still depends on horses, despite all the mechanization. And people, always people. Soldiers heading east to fill the gaps left by casualties. Sailors manning the merchant vessels that keep Britain fed. This morning, December 6th, the harbour is particularly busy. There's a convoy forming up, dozens of ships that will soon set out together, safety in numbers against the submarines. In Bedford Basin, the large protected area north of the Narrows, vessels sit at anchor, waiting. Some are already loaded. Some are taking on last-minute supplies. Some are just arriving, needing to join the convoy. 2 ships are about to change everything, but you don't know their names yet. You don't know that the SS Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship, is carrying a load so dangerous that by all rights it should never have been allowed near a populated area. You don't know that the SS Imo, a Norwegian vessel chartered to carry relief supplies to Belgium, is running late and in a hurry. You don't know that a series of small decisions, minor miscommunications, and simple bad luck is about to combine into something catastrophic. The Mont Blanc entered the harbour yesterday evening, too late to proceed through the anti-submarine nets, so it anchored outside for the night. Now, around 8:45 in the morning, it's making its way through the Narrows, heading for Bedford Basin, where it will wait for the convoy. It's loaded with benzol, picric acid, TNT, and gun cotton. Essentially, it's a floating bomb, more explosive force packed into one vessel than most people can comprehend. The IMO is coming the other direction. It should have left yesterday, but was delayed. Now it's trying to make up time, moving faster than is probably wise in these crowded waters. The harbour has rules about which side of the narrow ships should use. like traffic laws on a road. But the narrows are narrow, the name is literal, and with ships anchored on both sides, there isn't always a clear path. You're at work now, on the docks, part of a crew unloading timber from a ship that arrived 2 days ago. The wood is heavy, rough, full of splinters if you're not careful. You work in rhythm with the other men, a practiced coordination born of repetition. Load the sling, signal the crane operator, watch it rise, guide it as it swings over to the dock, unload, repeat, over and over, hour after hour. Around 9 o'clock, you pause for a moment, straightening your back, feeling the muscles protest. You look out at the harbour, at the ships moving through the narrows. 2 of them seem to be having some kind of trouble. They're approaching each other, and even from this distance, you can tell something isn't right. Ships that size don't approach each other head-on. Someone needs to give way. The Mont Blanc has started signalling. 1 short blast on its whistle, meaning it intends to pass port to port the correct way. The IMO responds with 2 short blasts, indicating it wants to pass starboard to starboard. This shouldn't be happening. The rules are clear. But the IMO isn't stopping, isn't slowing down enough. The Mont Blanc tries to maneuver. It turns to starboard, trying to get out of the way. But the IMO makes the same turn. Now they're on a collision course, and momentum doesn't forgive. These are massive vessels, thousands of tons each, and they don't stop or turn quickly. You watch, along with hundreds of others along the waterfront, as the inevitable unfolds with dreamlike slowness. The ships are going to hit. There's nothing anyone can do now. The harbour has gone quiet, or maybe you just can't hear anything over the sound of your own heart hammering in your chest. The IMO's bow strikes the Mont Blanc on its starboard side, punching into the hold. Metal screams. The impact isn't dramatic like in a movie. It's almost gentle, relatively speaking, but it's enough. Barrels of benzol are ruptured. The highly flammable liquid spills and vaporizes. Something, friction or a spark or just the sheer bad luck of the universe, ignites it. Fire blooms across the Mont Blanc's deck, bright even in the morning sunlight. The crew knows immediately what this means. They know what their ship is carrying. They know that they're standing on top of nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives that are now on fire. They don't waste time fighting the flames. They abandon ship, rowing frantically for the Dartmouth shore on the far side of the harbour, screaming warnings in French that most people don't understand. The Mont Blanc, burning furiously now, drifts toward the Richmond waterfront, toward the neighbourhood where you live, toward the docks where you're standing, watching with growing horror. Black smoke pours into the sky, and the flames are mesmerizing, terrible. Beautiful in the way that dangerous things can be. People gather to watch. This is a disaster, yes, but the kind of disaster that happens at sea. A ship on fire. It's exciting, in a way, a break from the routine. Children who should be in class have run out to sea. Women come to the windows of waterfront homes. Workers stop what they're doing. Everyone watches the burning ship drift closer to shore. Some people understand the danger. Someone in the naval dockyard knows what the Mont Blanc was carrying, sends a warning, but it doesn't spread fast enough or far enough. A few people run, heading away from the waterfront as fast as they can move. But most stay, most watch. Most have no idea that they have minutes, just minutes left to live. You're still on the dock. You should run. Every instinct should be screaming at you to run. But you don't. You stand there, transfixed, watching the burning ship settle against Pier 6, less than a quarter mile from where you stand. The flames are enormous now, and the heat is intense even at this distance. You can hear the fire roaring, a sound like a living thing, hungry and enormous. At 9 hours, 4 minutes and 35 seconds a.m., the Mont Blanc explodes. You don't hear it at first, which seems impossible, but the blast is so enormous that it overwhelms your senses. What you experience first is the light, a flash so bright it sears itself into your vision even through closed eyelids. Then comes the pressure wave, a wall of compressed air moving faster than sound, faster than thought. The explosion releases energy equivalent to roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT. For context, that's about a sixth of the power of the atomic bomb that will be dropped on Hiroshima 28 years in the future. It's the largest man-made explosion in human history up to this point, and it will hold that record until the nuclear age. If you're standing on the dock when it happens, you're simply gone. Vaporized isn't quite accurate, but it's close enough. The temperatures at the center of the blast exceed those on the surface of the sun for a fraction of a second. Your body doesn't have time to register pain. Your consciousness doesn't have time to process what's happening. You exist, and then you don't, erased from the world as thoroughly as if you'd never been there at all. But let's say you're not quite that close. Let's say you're further back, maybe helping sort cargo in one of the warehouses a few hundred yards from the waterfront. The pressure wave hits the building like the fist of an angry god. Walls that stood for decades disintegrate. The roof lifts into the air, breaks apart, becomes thousands of individual projectiles. Every window shatters simultaneously, and the glass becomes a horizontal storm of razors moving at hundreds of miles per hour. You're thrown through the air, and you don't understand why. You don't understand anything. Your mind can't process what's happening because nothing in your experience has prepared you for forces like this. You hit something, maybe a wall that's now falling, maybe the ground, maybe debris that used to be part of a building. The impact breaks bones, but you don't feel it yet. Shock is merciful that way, at least at first. The sound arrives last, which seems backwards, but that's how physics works when explosions are this large. It's not just loud. Loud doesn't capture it. It's a physical force, a pressure that you feel in your chest, in your skull, in every cavity of your body. Many people's eardrums simply rupture. The lucky ones are knocked unconscious immediately. The blast creates a crater where Pier 6 used to be, 50 feet deep in places, and the harbor floor is torn up, reshaped by unimaginable violence. A tsunami, 60 feet high in some places, surges away from the explosion, rushing toward both shores. It picks up ships like toys, smashes them against the waterfront, or carries them inland, depositing them on land where ships have no business being. The Richmond neighborhood, where you woke up this morning, where you had breakfast with your family, where your children left for school, ceases to exist as a coherent place. Homes are flattened in an instant. The Acadia sugar refinery, the solid industrial building that employed hundreds, is leveled. The Richmond school, where your son should be sitting in class, collapses. Most of the children inside are killed instantly. Some are buried in rubble. Some are thrown clear but broken beyond repair. Your own home, the modest wooden structure where your wife was probably starting the day's chores, is matchwood now. Walls, roof, furniture, all the small possessions that made up your family's life, scattered or burning or simply gone. If your wife was inside, she didn't suffer long. That's the only mercy in any of this. The explosion generates a pressure wave that races outward at more than 1,000 miles per hour initially, slowing but still devastating at distance. Windows shatter miles away. In Truro, 60 miles distant, people feel their houses shake. The sound is heard in Cape Breton, nearly 200 miles away. A mushroom cloud rises above Halifax. visible for dozens of miles. A harbinger of weapons that won't exist for another generation. Debris falls from the sky like deadly rain. Pieces of the Mont Blanc, some weighing tons, are scattered for miles. One section of the ship's hull, weighing over half a ton, lands nearly 2 miles away. A cannon from the deck is found over 3 miles from the explosion site. The IMO, which caused this catastrophe through nothing more than bad navigation and worse timing, is picked up by the blast and thrown onto the Dartmouth shore. Most of its crew survives, which seems cosmically unfair. The pilot who was guiding the Mont Blanc through the harbour dies. Along with the harbour pilot on the IMO, blame will be assigned later, lawsuits filed, but in this moment, none of that matters. Fire spreads through what's left of Richmond. Gas lines have ruptured. Overturned stoves in collapsed homes ignite whatever will burn. The explosion happened in winter, so many people had fires going for heat. Now those fires have nothing to contain them. The wooden buildings, or what remains of them, burn eagerly. Black smoke pours into the morning sky, mixing with the debris cloud. In the immediate aftermath, survivors stumble through a landscape transformed into hell. People wander, bleeding, deaf, blind, confused. Many are naked or nearly so, their clothes torn off by the blast. The injured outnumber the dead, which is its own kind of tragedy because there's no way to help them all. The city's medical infrastructure is overwhelmed immediately. Hospitals themselves have been damaged. Doctors and nurses are among the casualties. The old saying that war is hell becomes literally true for Halifax. The destruction rivals anything on the Western Front. Entire blocks are obliterated. Bodies are everywhere, or pieces of bodies. Some people are killed by the blast itself. Some by the tsunami. Some by flying debris. Some by the fires that follow. Some by collapsed buildings. The ways to die are numerous and inventive and utterly random. A mother shields her children with her body, and they survive while she doesn't. A man steps out of his house to investigate the burning ship and is shredded by flying glass. A family huddled in their basement survives unscathed, while their neighbors 10 feet away are crushed. There's no logic to it, no fairness, no divine plan that anyone can discern. Just chaos and violence on a scale that shouldn't be possible outside of war zones. And Halifax isn't a war zone, except now it is. Nearly 2,000 people die, most in the first few seconds. 9,000 are injured, many maimed for life. Hundreds lose their eyes, blinded by flying glass or the sheer force of the blast. Burns are common and horrific. Crush injuries, amputations performed by trauma rather than surgeons. The list of horrors is comprehensive and specific and utterly overwhelming. 1/4 of Halifax's population is left homeless in an instant. In winter, in December, in Nova Scotia, where temperatures drop well below freezing. 25,000 people have nowhere to go, no shelter, no food, no water. The infrastructure that supports urban life, water mains, gas lines, electricity, communication systems, is wrecked. The city is, in most meaningful ways, destroyed. This is why you wouldn't survive the Halifax explosion. Not because you weren't tough enough, or smart enough, or fast enough, but because when physics decides to demonstrate what happens when 3,000 tons of high explosives detonate in a populated area, personal attributes don't matter. You're at the mercy of mathematics and shockwaves and the fragility of human flesh. And if, by some chance, you did survive the initial blast, you'd face the fires, the cold, the lack of medical care, the psychological trauma of watching your entire world unmade in less than a minute. You'd survive into a nightmare that you couldn't wake up from. surrounded by death and destruction on a scale that your mind couldn't properly process. This was Halifax on December 6, 1917. A normal Thursday morning that became, in the span of a heartbeat, one of the worst disasters in Canadian history. And we're just getting started understanding what happened here, how people responded, what it meant, and what lessons, if any, can be extracted from tragedy on this scale. The story of Vince Coleman, the dispatcher who stayed. In every disaster, there are stories of individual choice, moments when a person decides whether to save themselves or try to save others. The Halifax Explosion has several such stories, but perhaps none captures the essence of heroism and the terrible cost of heroism, quite like the story of Vincent Coleman. Vince Coleman was a trained dispatcher, not a soldier, not a first responder in the modern sense, just a railway worker doing his job on what should have been an ordinary Thursday morning. He was 35 years old, married to a woman named Frances, father to 8 children. 8. In 1917, that wasn't unusual, but it gives you a sense of the life he was building, the responsibilities he carried, the reasons he had to stay alive. He worked for the Intercolonial Railway in the Richmond rail yards, close to the waterfront. Very close, dangerously close, as it would turn out. The rail yards were crucial to Halifax's role as a wartime port. Every bit of cargo that moved through the city, every soldier heading to Europe, every supply shipment, it all went through the railways. The yards were always busy, a complicated choreography of trains arriving, departing, being loaded, being switched from track to track. On the morning of December 6th, Coleman was in the Railway Telegraph Office, a small building near the rail yards. It was his job to coordinate train movements, to send and receive messages, to make sure that the intricate dance of locomotives and cargo cars didn't result in collisions or delays. He was good at his job, reliable, the kind of worker who showed up on time and did what needed doing without complaint. Around 8:45 a.m., he would have been aware of the usual morning activity. Trains being prepared, workers moving between the cars, the constant background noise of an industrial operation. The harbour was visible from the rail yards, so he would have seen the ships moving through the Narrows, though he probably didn't pay them much attention. Ships were the Navy's business. He had trains to worry about. Then came the collision. Even from the rail yards, it would have been obvious that something was wrong. The sound of metal on metal carries across water. People started gathering, looking toward the harbour, watching as the Mont Blanc began to burn. Coleman likely stepped outside, along with his fellow workers, to see what was happening. This is where the story becomes specific, where we know details because of what Coleman did next, because his actions were witnessed and recorded and remembered. A sailor from the HMS Highflyer, a British ship docked nearby, came running to the rail yards. He was shouting warnings, probably in English, possibly with the kind of urgent desperation that transcends language. The burning ship was loaded with explosives. It was going to explode. Everyone needed to run, needed to get as far away as possible. Most people, hearing this, would run, should run. Self-preservation is the most basic instinct. The sailor had just given everyone in the rail yards permission, instruction even, to abandon their posts and flee. No one would blame them. No one could blame them. Coleman understood the danger immediately. He wasn't stupid, wasn't in denial. He knew what an explosion that size would do. He knew how close he was to the waterfront. He knew, with the certainty that must have felt like ice in his stomach, that he was probably going to die. But he also knew something else. There was a passenger train approaching Halifax from St. John, New Brunswick. Train number 10, a regular run, carrying roughly 300 passengers. It was due to arrive in the north end of the city, in Richmond, right where the rail yards were, right where the burning ship was drifting, right in the zone that was about to become ground zero for the largest explosion in human history. If that train arrived on schedule, 300 more people would die. Men, women, children, passengers who had no idea what was waiting for them, who were probably looking forward to arriving in Halifax. Maybe seeing family, maybe conducting business, maybe just glad that a long train journey was almost over. Coleman had maybe 15 minutes, possibly less. The ship was burning furiously. It could explode at any moment. Every second he stayed was a second closer to death. Every rational thought in his head must have been screaming at him to run, to save himself, to think of Francis and the 8 children who needed their father. He went back into the telegraph office. His colleague, William Lovett, was there. They looked at each other, and in that look was an entire conversation, a mutual understanding of what they were about to do. They could have run together. They could have saved themselves. Instead, they stayed. Coleman sat down at the telegraph key and began sending a message. His hands would have been shaking. Maybe, or maybe they were steady. We don't know. We know the message he sent though. It's been preserved, recorded, remembered. It read, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbour making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Guess this will be my last message." The understatement is almost unbearable. He knew he wasn't guessing. He knew he was about to die. And he took the time to say goodbye to the other telegraph operators who would receive his message. Men he worked with, probably knew by name, maybe considered friends. The message went out at 9:04 a.m. Along the railway line, operators received it, read it, understood immediately. They stopped train number 10. They cleared other trains from the area. They prevented a catastrophe from becoming even worse, though worse seems impossible given what was about to happen. Coleman's message was received at 9 hours, 4 minutes and 35 seconds a.m. At that exact moment, the Mont Blanc exploded. The telegraph office was obliterated. The blast wave hit it with undiminished force, turned the building into splinters and fragments. Coleman and Lovett died instantly as anyone can die. Their bodies were never found, at least not intact, not in any way that could be identified. They were simply erased, removed from the world as thoroughly as the building they'd been inside. But train number 10 stopped. 300 people lived because Vincent Coleman stayed at his post. 300 people who never knew how close they came to death, who probably read about the explosion in newspapers and felt sympathy for Halifax, but didn't realize they'd almost been part of the casualty count. Coleman's story spread quickly after the disaster. In a tragedy this large, people need heroes, need to find meaning, need to believe that individual action matters even when faced with forces beyond human control. Coleman provided that. His sacrifice was clear, unambiguous, heroic in the most traditional sense. He had a choice, and he chose to save others at the cost of his own life. The Canadian government awarded him posthumously, though awards seem inadequate given the cost. His family received a pension, though no amount of money replaces a husband and father. Monuments were erected, though stone and bronze are poor substitutes for a living person. His name is remembered, taught in schools, part of the historical record, but his children grew up without him. If this helped you relax and learn about history's most pivotal moments, take a moment to leave a comment below about what topic you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and let us know how you're doing. You're an important part of our little corner of the internet, and we're grateful you're here with us tonight. There's something almost unbearably sad about Coleman's story, beyond the obvious tragedy of his death. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't signed up for danger. He wasn't trained for heroism. He was just a railway worker, a family man, someone trying to make a living in difficult times. The explosion wasn't an enemy he could fight, wasn't a challenge he could overcome through skill or courage. It was just physics and chemistry and terrible timing. And yet, when the moment came, when he had to choose between certain death with purpose and possible survival through flight, he chose purpose. He chose to stay. He chose to send the message, even knowing it would be his last. This raises uncomfortable questions about what we expect from ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Should Coleman have run? Would it have been wrong, morally speaking, to save himself? He had 8 children. Francis needed him. His family needed him. 300 strangers on a train versus his own life and his family's future. Is there a right answer to that equation? We celebrate his choice because the alternative is too bleak to contemplate. If we accept that self-preservation always trumps helping others, then society becomes impossible. We need to believe that people will sometimes choose to help, even at terrible cost to themselves, because otherwise civilization is just a thin veneer over selfishness and survival instinct. But celebrating Coleman's choice also means acknowledging what it cost. He died at 35, leaving his wife a widow and 8 children without a father. In 1917, without a father's income, that family faced real hardship. Pensions helped, but they weren't generous. Francis Coleman had to raise those children alone, had to explain to them why their father wasn't coming home, had to make peace with the fact that her husband had chosen to save strangers rather than return to his family. Was it worth it? 300 lives saved. 8 children without a father. How do you calculate that? How do you decide if the trade was acceptable? The answer is that you can't, not really. Moral mathematics doesn't work that way. Some choices are impossible, and we honor the people who make them while being grateful we don't have to. Coleman wasn't the only hero that day. There were many others, people who pulled survivors from rubble, who fought fires, who provided medical care, who opened their homes to the homeless. But Coleman's story is distinctive because of its clarity, its terrible simplicity. He knew he would die. He stayed anyway. He saved people he would never meet. The passenger train that he stopped, train number 10, would have arrived in Richmond probably within minutes of the explosion. If Coleman hadn't sent his warning, if the train had continued, it would have been in the rail yards or approaching them when the Mont Blanc detonated. 300 passengers would have been added to the casualty list. The train itself would have been destroyed, possibly derailed, possibly exploded if it was carrying anything flammable. Instead, the train stopped safely miles away. The passengers probably complained about the delay. They might have been annoyed, might have wondered why they were sitting on the tracks instead of pulling into the station. Then word would have reached them about the explosion, about what had happened in Halifax, about how close they'd come to being part of it. Did they ever learn about Coleman? Did they know that a man they'd never met had died to save them? Some of them must have. In the days and weeks after the explosion, Coleman's story was widely reported. It's possible that some of those passengers, reading about the disaster, reading about the telegraph operator who stayed at his post, realized they owed their lives to him. It's also possible many of them never knew. They survived, went on with their lives, and Coleman's sacrifice remained abstract, just another story from a distant disaster. That's perhaps the cruelest part of heroism. Sometimes the people you save never know you saved them. The alternative timeline where they died doesn't exist for them to contemplate. They just continue living, unaware of how close they came to not doing so. Frances Coleman knew that she knew exactly what her husband had given up, exactly what he'd chosen. She lived another 4 decades after the explosion, dying in 1959 at the age of 80. Did she spend those 42 years proud of Vince's choice, or angry at it, or some complicated mixture of both? We don't know. She left no recorded reflections on her husband's death, at least none that survive in the historical record. The Coleman children grew up as children do. They married, had children of their own, built lives in the shadow of their father's sacrifice. Some of them were old enough to remember him, to have actual memories rather than just stories. The younger ones would have known him only through what others told them, through photographs, if any survived the explosion, through the weight of a legacy they didn't choose. In 1992, 75 years after the explosion, Canada Post issued a commemorative stamp featuring Vincent Coleman. It shows him at the telegraph key, stylized and heroic. It's a nice gesture, the kind of thing governments do to honor the past. But stamps don't bring people back. Monuments and plaques and commemorations are for the living ways we make sense of tragedy and loss. The Halifax explosion fundamentally changed how dangerous cargoes are handled in ports. Regulations were strengthened. Safety procedures were implemented. The idea that a ship carrying 3,000 tons of high explosives should be allowed to navigate through a crowded harbor near a populated area became unthinkable. Coleman's death, and the deaths of nearly 2,000 others, brought that lesson in the most expensive currency possible. Would Coleman have sent his warning if he'd known that his sacrifice would lead to better safety regulations, that future generations would be protected by rules written in response to this disaster? Probably. That seems consistent with the choice he made. But he didn't know that. He just knew a train was coming, and people were going to die unless someone warned them. And he was the person in position to send that warning. The simplicity of his choice is what makes it so powerful and so terrible. There was no time for complex ethical reasoning, no opportunity to consult with others or think through all the implications. Just a burning ship, a ticking clock, and a telegraph key. He acted on instinct, or on training, or on some fundamental sense of duty that overrode self-preservation. We tell Coleman's story because we want to believe that we would make the same choice, that we would stay at our posts, that we would save others, even at cost to ourselves. But we tell it also knowing that most of us will never face such a choice, and we're grateful for that. Heroism is admirable, but survival is not shameful. Most people ran that morning, and they're not remembered as cowards. They're just remembered as survivors, if they're remembered at all. Coleman stands out because he didn't run. Because when everything in his biology and his psychology was screaming at him to flee, he stayed. Because he loved people he'd never met enough to die for them. Because he understood that 300 lives were worth his one life. Even though from his family's perspective, his one life was worth everything. The last words he sent, "Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys," are carved into memorials, quoted in histories, taught to schoolchildren. They're famous now, part of Canadian heritage, part of the story of the explosion. But when he wrote them, they were just a farewell, a moment of human connection in the face of incoming oblivion. He was saying goodbye to colleagues, to men who worked the same job, who understood what he was doing and what it would cost. Those operators, receiving that message, reading those words, knowing what was about to happen, must have felt a particular kind of horror. They were helpless. They couldn't save Coleman. They couldn't stop the explosion. All they could do was honor his warning, stop the trains, and live with the knowledge that a fellow operator had died at his post so others might live. Train number 10 continued its journey after the danger passed, arriving in Halifax later that day to find a city transformed by disaster. The passengers who had been saved by Coleman's warning stepped off into a nightmare landscape, into a city that was broken and burning and overwhelmed with casualties. Some of them probably helped with rescue efforts. Some probably just tried to leave as quickly as possible. Either response would have been understandable. Vincent Coleman's story is the story of the Halifax Explosion in microcosm. An ordinary person living an ordinary life, suddenly confronted with extraordinary circumstances and impossible choices. He made his choice, and it cost him everything, and it saved hundreds of lives, and it made him a hero, and it left his family without him. All of these things are true simultaneously, and there's no way to reconcile them into a neat moral lesson. What we're left with is the fact of his sacrifice, the reality of his choice, and the uncomfortable knowledge that heroism often demands prices that seem too high to pay. We honor Coleman because we must, because not honoring him would be worse, would suggest that his sacrifice was meaningless or wasted. But honoring him also means acknowledging what was lost. Not just his life, but all the years he didn't get to live. All the moments with his family that never happened. All the futures that were foreclosed when he chose to stay at that telegraph key. The Halifax explosion killed nearly 2,000 people in seconds, injured 9,000 more, and traumatized an entire city. It was a disaster on a scale that defies easy comprehension, but within that massive tragedy are thousands of individual stories, personal moments of choice and consequence. Vincent Coleman's story is just one, but it's one we remember because it shows us something about human capacity for sacrifice, even as it reminds us of the terrible cost of that sacrifice. If you were Vincent Coleman, sitting in that telegraph office, knowing what was coming, would you have stayed? Would you have sent the message? Or would you have run, tried to save yourself, tried to get back to Francis and the 8 children? There's no wrong answer, really. Survival is a valid choice. But Coleman chose differently, and 300 people lived because of it, and that matters, even as we mourn what it cost. The impossible physics, understanding what should never have happened. There's a question that haunts the Halifax explosion. A question that doesn't have a satisfying answer because the answer is just a series of small failures and bad luck compounding into catastrophe. The question is simple. How did this happen? Not the mechanics of the explosion itself. Those are well understood. When you pack nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives into a single vessel and set it on fire, the resulting detonation is predictable, almost inevitable. The physics are straightforward, brutally so. No, the real question is, how did anyone think it was acceptable to bring a floating bomb into a crowded harbor, to navigate it through narrow channels past a populated city, to treat it like just another cargo ship? The answer requires understanding the context of 1917, the third winter of what everyone was now calling the Great War, though there was nothing great about it except the scale of the killing. The war had become an insatiable machine, consuming men and materials at rates that would have seemed impossible before 1914. Artillery shells were being expended by the millions. A single offensive could require more ammunition than entire previous wars had used. The logistics of keeping armies supplied had become as important as the fighting itself. This meant ships, thousands of ships, crossing the Atlantic in convoys, running the gauntlet of German submarines that prowled the shipping lanes. It meant ports working around the clock, loading and unloading cargo. turning ships around as fast as possible because every day a vessel sat idle was a day it wasn't serving the war effort. It meant cutting corners, accepting risks that in peacetime would have been unthinkable, because the alternative was losing the war. The SS Mont Blanc was a French cargo ship built in 1899, getting old by 1917 but still serviceable. It had been loaded in New York with a cargo that, if anyone had really thought about it, should never have been assembled in one place. In the holds below deck were 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, and 10 tons of gun cotton. On the deck, because there was no room below, were barrels of benzol, a highly flammable fuel. Picric acid is nasty stuff. It's an explosive, yes, but it's also corrosive and toxic. It can explode when subjected to shock or heat, which makes it dangerous to transport, even in the best conditions. TNT is more stable, relatively speaking, but it's still a high explosive, designed to detonate with maximum force. Gun cotton is nitrocellulose, another powerful explosive, and benzol, the fuel in the deck barrels, was essentially just waiting for an excuse to ignite. Individually, each of these cargoes would have required special handling, careful stowage, experienced crews who understood what they were working with. Together, they created a vessel that was, by any reasonable standard, a maritime disaster waiting to happen. The Mont Blanc wasn't a ship anymore, not really. It was a bomb, 3,000 tons of explosive force compressed into a hull of steel plates and rivets. But this was wartime, and Britain and France needed explosives desperately. The Western Front consumed ammunition at staggering rates. Every shell fired had to be manufactured, transported, delivered to the front lines. The logistics were nightmarish, and they required risks. The Mont Blanc was supposed to join a convoy in Halifax, then cross the Atlantic to France, where its cargo would be unloaded and used to feed the artillery batteries that dominated modern warfare. The ship's captain, Aim LeMedic, knew what he was carrying. His crew knew they weren't fools. They understood that they were sailing on top of enough explosives to level a small city. But this was their job, and the war demanded it, and so they did it. They took precautions. The holds were sealed carefully. Smoking was absolutely forbidden, on pain of immediate dismissal or worse. The crew was experienced, professional, aware of the dangers. What they couldn't control was luck, or the lack thereof. The Mont Blanc arrived at Halifax on December 5th in the evening, too late to pass through the anti-submarine nets that protected the harbour. These nets were strung across the harbour entrance, raised and lowered on a schedule to allow friendly ships through while theoretically keeping German submarines out. Missing the schedule meant anchoring outside overnight and entering the next morning. December 6, 1917, the Mont Blanc entered Halifax Harbour around 8:45 a.m., proceeding carefully through the narrows toward Bedford Basin, where it would wait for the convoy to assemble. The narrows are well named. At the narrowest point, the channel is only about 400 meters wide, roughly a quarter mile. For large ships, this doesn't leave much room for error. There are rules about navigation, about which side of the channel ships should use, about right-of-way and signaling. At the same time, coming the other direction, was the SS Imo, a Norwegian ship chartered to carry relief supplies to Belgium. The Imo was in a hurry. It had been delayed the previous day by bureaucratic issues, and its captain Håkon from wanted to make up time. The ship was moving faster than was probably wise given the traffic in the Narrows. What happened next has been analysed exhaustively, investigated by inquiries in courts, debated by maritime experts and historians. The basic facts are clear. The two ships approached each other in the Narrows. The Mont Blanc was on its proper side of the channel, hugging the Dartmouth shore. The IMO was more toward the middle, possibly to avoid some moored vessels on the Halifax side. Ships communicate through whistle signals. One short blast means I am directing my course to starboard, which in maritime terms means turning right. Two short blasts mean I am directing my course to port, turning left. These aren't suggestions. They're the maritime equivalent of traffic signals, and ignoring them or misunderstanding them can be fatal. The Mont Blanc signaled with one short blast, indicating it would pass port to port with the IMO. This was the correct procedure. The IMO responded with two short blasts, indicating it wanted to pass starboard to starboard. This created immediate confusion. Both ships were now signaling different intentions. The Mont Blanc's pilot, Francis Mackey, was experienced, knew these waters well. He must have felt a spike of alarm when he heard the IMO's tube-blast signal. He tried to maneuver, turning his ship to starboard to give the IMO more room. But the IMO made the same turn, and now the two ships were on a direct collision course. At this point, the momentum of both vessels made collision almost inevitable. These were large ships, thousands of tons each. They couldn't stop quickly. They couldn't turn sharply. The harbor pilots on both ships were experienced professionals, but they were working with the limitations of early 20th century maritime technology and the simple physics of mass and motion. The IMO struck the Mont Blanc on the starboard side, its bow punching into the cargo hold. The impact wasn't catastrophic by itself. Ships collided in harbors with some regularity. Usually it meant damage, delays, repairs, insurance claims, not explosions. But the Mont Blanc wasn't a normal ship. The collision ruptured barrels of benzol on deck. The highly flammable liquid spilled, vaporized, and ignited. Accounts differ on exactly what caused the spark. Friction from the collision, perhaps. Metal scraping on metal. Something electrical. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that within seconds, the deck of the Mont Blanc was engulfed in flames. The crew abandoned ship immediately. They knew, with absolute certainty, what would happen if the fire reached the explosives in the holds below. They didn't hesitate, didn't try to fight the flames, didn't waste time. They lowered boats and rowed frantically for shore, screaming warnings in French that most people didn't understand or didn't take seriously. Captain Lemedec and his crew made it to the Dartmouth shore and kept running, getting as far from the burning ship as they could. They were criticized for this later, accused of cowardice, though what exactly they were supposed to do is unclear. Stay aboard a burning ship loaded with explosives, die uselessly trying to fight a fire that couldn't be controlled. Their decision to abandon ship and run probably saved their lives. The burning Mont Blanc drifted toward Pier 6 on the Halifax waterfront, pushed by the current and its remaining momentum. This was one of the tragic ironies of the disaster. If the ship had stayed in the middle of the harbor, the explosion would have been devastating but less catastrophic. Instead, it came to rest against a wooden pier in the middle of a densely populated neighborhood. For about 20 minutes, the ship burned. Those 20 minutes represent a window when, theoretically, the disaster could have been prevented or mitigated. If everyone within a mile had been evacuated immediately, the death toll would have been dramatically lower. But evacuation would have required understanding the danger, communicating it effectively, and convincing thousands of people to abandon their homes and workplaces based on the warning of a burning ship. Some people did understand. Someone in the naval dockyard knew what the Mont Blanc was carrying and tried to spread a warning, but it didn't reach far enough fast enough. A few individuals, grasping the danger intuitively or through knowledge of explosives, ran as far and as fast as they could. They survived. Most people didn't run, they watched. A burning ship was interesting, dramatic, maybe even exciting in a morbid way. It broke up the monotony of wartime routine. People gathered at windows, on rooftops, along the waterfront. Children who should have been in school came out to see. Sailors from ships docked nearby came to gawk. Workers paused in their labor to watch the spectacle. This is one of the most haunting aspects of the disaster. If you look at casualty reports, at where people died, there's a clear pattern. Many were killed while watching the burning ship. They were standing at windows when the blast wave turned those windows into fragmenting projectiles. They were on decks of ships in the harbor. They were gathered on docks and along the waterfront. They died because they stopped to watch, because human nature draws us toward spectacle, even when spectacle is dangerous. At 9 hours, 4 minutes and 35 seconds a.m., approximately 20 minutes after the collision, the fire reached the Mont Blanc's cargo holds. The explosives detonated. The physics of what happened next are well understood now, though they wouldn't be fully explained until the nuclear age provided context for explosions of this magnitude. The chemical energy stored in the explosives, the potential energy of molecular bonds, was released essentially instantaneously. Chemical reactions that normally take time were compressed into microseconds. The explosion released approximately 2.9 kilotons of TNT equivalent energy. For scale, that's about 12 trillion joules. Enough energy to power a city for weeks if it could somehow be harnessed gradually instead of released all at once. The temperature at the center of the blast briefly exceeded 5,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. The pressure wave, the blast wave, expanded outward at supersonic speeds initially. At the waterfront, less than 100 meters from the ship, the the pressure above normal atmospheric pressure was on the order of thousands of pounds per square inch. Human bodies can't withstand that kind of force. Buildings can't withstand it. The only things that survive are solid bedrock and luck. As the pressure wave expanded, it weakened, but it remained destructive for miles. Windows shattered throughout Halifax and in Dartmouth on the opposite shore. The structural damage radius, the zone where buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged, extended for roughly a mile from the explosion site. Beyond that, there was still significant damage. Broken windows and cracked walls and displaced roof tiles for another mile or two. The explosion created a crater where Pier 6 had been, excavating the harbor bottom and displacing thousands of tons of water and sediment. The displaced water created a tsunami that rushed toward both shores, a wall of water carrying debris, oil, and the remains of the Mont Blanc. On the Halifax side, the wave reached heights of 18 meters, nearly 60 feet in some areas. It smashed ships against the waterfront, deposited boats on land, and added drowning to the list of ways people died that morning. The Mont Blanc itself ceased to exist as a coherent object. The ship was torn apart at the molecular level, vaporized in the center of the blast, fragmented and scattered everywhere else. Pieces of the hull were found miles away. The ship's anchor shank, weighing over half a ton, landed nearly 2 miles from the explosion site. It's still there, preserved as a monument, a piece of twisted metal that serves as a reminder of forces too large for human scale. The explosion generated a mushroom cloud, rising thousands of feet into the air, visible for dozens of miles. It was a harbinger of the atomic age, though nobody in 1917 could have understood that. The cloud was composed of water vapor, debris, combustion products, and pulverized everything. It rose and spread, and then debris began to fall like deadly rain. Pieces of metal, fragments of wood, chunks of masonry, all the shattered remnants of buildings and ships and the Mont Blanc itself falling across the city. The sound of the explosion was heard over 100 miles away. People in Cape Breton, nearly 200 miles distant, thought they heard thunder or artillery fire. The pressure wave was detected by seismographs, recorded as if it were an earthquake. In a sense, it was the explosion released seismic energy, shook the ground, sent ripples through the earth that could be measured and analyzed. What makes the Halifax explosion particularly interesting from a scientific and historical perspective is that it provided data points for understanding large-scale explosions. The damage patterns, the blast effects, the injuries, all of it was documented and studied. This information would later be used, grimly, to predict the effects of atomic weapons. The people studying the Halifax disaster in the 1920s and 1930s were inadvertently preparing humanity to understand nuclear warfare. But in 1917, nobody was thinking about future weapons. They were dealing with an immediate catastrophe, trying to understand how a ship collision had turned into an explosion that rivaled the largest artillery bombardments of the war. The investigations began almost immediately, even as rescue efforts were still ongoing. There were inquiries, trials, lawsuits. People wanted answers, wanted to assign blame, wanted to believe that such a disaster could be prevented in the future. The pilot of the Mont Blanc, Francis Mackey, was initially blamed. He was put on trial, charged with manslaughter and criminal negligence. The argument was that he should have done more to avoid the collision, should have signaled differently, should have maneuvered his ship better. He was eventually acquitted. The courts concluded that the collision was the result of errors on both ships, that neither pilot was solely to blame. The IMO's pilot, William Hayes, died in the explosion, which made assigning blame to him problematic. Dead men can't defend themselves, can't explain their decisions, can't be prosecuted. But the investigation suggested that the IMO had been traveling too fast, had been on the wrong side of the channel, had contributed significantly to the collision. Ultimately, though, what caused the disaster wasn't any single decision or error. It was a system that allowed a ship loaded with 3,000 tons of high explosives to navigate through a crowded harbor. It was wartime pressures that made such risks seem acceptable. It was a series of small miscommunications and navigation errors that compounded into catastrophe. It was, in the most frustrating sense, just bad luck. Could it have been prevented? Yes, in numerous ways. If the Mont Blanc had been routed around Halifax instead of through it, if the loading had been done differently, with the most dangerous cargo loaded last and unloaded first, if there had been better communication between the ships, if the IMO had been traveling slower, if. Hindsight provides endless opportunities for prevention, but nobody in December 1917 had the benefit of hindsight. What we can say with certainty is that the Halifax explosion demonstrated the dangers of complacency with dangerous materials. In the aftermath, regulations changed. Protocols for handling explosives in populated areas were strengthened. The lessons were learned, though the tuition was paid in lives. The explosion also provided, albeit tragically, a preview of what was to come. The Halifax explosion was the largest man-made explosion until the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the mushroom cloud, the blast effects, the firestorms. All of it would be seen again on an even larger scale, when nuclear weapons entered human arsenals. Scientists studying nuclear weapons effects in the 1940s looked at the Halifax data. They examined the damage patterns, the casualty figures, the blast radius calculations. The Halifax explosion became a macabre case study, A real-world example of what happens when enormous amounts of energy are released instantaneously in a populated area. There's something deeply unsettling about this. The nearly 2,000 people who died in Halifax became, posthumously and unknowingly, data points for understanding future weapons. Their suffering provided information that would be used to predict and plan for even greater suffering. The explosion that killed them became a tool for understanding how to kill even more efficiently. But perhaps there's also something meaningful in it. The Halifax disaster taught lessons about evacuation, about emergency response, about treating blast injuries and burns. When atomic weapons were used, some of the medical knowledge, some of the understanding of how to respond to mass casualty events came from Halifax. The dead of 1917 inadvertently helped prepare humanity for the disasters of 1945 and beyond. The mystery of the Halifax explosion, then, isn't really a mystery at all. We know what happened, we know why, we know how. The explosion occurred because wartime necessity overrode peacetime caution, because systems failed at multiple points, because two ships collided in a narrow channel and one of them happened to be loaded with enough explosives to destroy a city. What remains mysterious, perhaps, is how humanity continues to take such risks, how we continue to transport dangerous materials through populated areas, how we balance the needs of commerce and war against the safety of civilians. The Halifax explosion should have been a final, definitive lesson. But explosions continue, disasters continue, and we continue to learn the same lessons at terrible cost. The physics are clear, the history is documented. What we still struggle with is the human element, the decisions and pressures and random chances that combine to create catastrophe. That's the real mystery, and it's one we haven't solved yet. After the blast, the city that refused to die when the smoke cleared, when the debris stopped falling, when the echoes of the explosion finally faded into horrified silence, Halifax faced a question that had no good answer. Now what? The scope of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Nearly 2,000 dead, though the exact number would never be known with certainty because some people were simply vaporized, leaving nothing to count or identify. 9,000 injured, many of them maimed for life, blinded, burned, crushed. 25,000 homeless in the middle of a Canadian winter. An entire neighborhood, Richmond, essentially erased from the map. Infrastructure destroyed. Water mains broken. Gas lines ruptured. Fires burning out of control. And it was December in Nova Scotia, where winter is not a gentle season, where temperatures drop well below freezing, where snow and ice are constants, where exposure kills. The explosion had destroyed thousands of homes right as people needed shelter most desperately. It had come in the morning when stoves were lit for warmth, and those overturned stoves had started fires that spread through the wreckage. Halifax was burning and freezing simultaneously. The immediate aftermath was chaos in its purest form. Survivors wandered through the ruins, bleeding, deaf from the blast. Many of them naked, or nearly so, because the explosion had torn away their clothes. They were looking for family members, for shelter, for help that didn't exist yet, because the city's emergency services had been overwhelmed instantly. Doctors and nurses were among the casualties. Hospitals had been damaged. The infrastructure for responding to disaster had itself been destroyed by the disaster. But here's where the story becomes something other than just tragedy. Here's where we see what humans are capable of when confronted with the worst. Halifax didn't collapse. It didn't descend into panic or chaos or every person for themselves survival. Instead, it organized, it responded, it saved itself with help from outside. Yes, but primarily through the efforts of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Within minutes of the explosion, even before the fires had been contained, even while debris was still falling, people began helping each other. Neighbors pulled neighbors from collapsed buildings. Strangers carried injured people to whatever medical facilities were still functioning. Those with homes that were still standing opened their doors to the homeless. Those with medical training, professional or improvised, began treating the wounded. The military responded quickly. Halifax was a military town, filled with soldiers and sailors, and they had training for emergencies, discipline, organization. Troops were mobilized to fight fires, to search for survivors in the rubble, to maintain order. Naval personnel from the ships in the harbor, many of which had been damaged but not destroyed, came ashore to help. These were men trained for war, and they approached the disaster with military efficiency. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. The scale of the disaster exceeded anything the city could handle on its own. Halifax needed help, needed it immediately, needed it in quantities that seemed impossible to deliver. And somehow, impossibly, that help arrived. The key was communication. The telegraph lines, remarkably, had mostly survived. Messages began going out within hours of the explosion, calling for help, describing the disaster, requesting medical supplies, doctors, nurses, relief workers, food, blankets, building materials. The messages went to other cities in Nova Scotia, to New Brunswick, to Quebec, to Ontario, to the United States. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Boston Red Cross, learning of the disaster, mobilized a relief train that left that same evening. December 6th, loaded with medical personnel and supplies. It arrived in Halifax the next morning, less than 24 hours after the explosion, bringing doctors, nurses, medical supplies, and the beginnings of organized relief efforts. Boston's response was so quick and so generous that Halifax has sent a Christmas tree to Boston every year since 1918 as a thank you, a tradition that continues to this day. But Boston wasn't alone. Relief efforts came from across Canada and the northeastern United States. Trains arrived carrying supplies, personnel, and aid. Money poured in, donations from individuals, businesses, governments. By December 8th, just 2 days after the explosion, organized relief efforts were underway, coordinated by committees formed from survivors and aided by professionals from outside. The medical response was particularly impressive given the challenges. Eye injuries were epidemic. The explosion had occurred in the morning when people were in their homes, when many were looking out windows to see what the commotion was about. When the blast wave hit, those windows became thousands of fragments traveling at high velocity. Hundreds of people lost their eyes, some lost both. The demand for ophthalmologists exceeded supply by orders of magnitude. Burns were another major category of injury. The explosion had generated intense heat. The fires that followed had trapped people or caught them in the open. Burn treatment in 1917 was primitive by modern standards, and infection was a constant danger. Many people who survived the initial blast died days or weeks later from infected wounds. Crush injuries from collapsed buildings, fractures, lacerations, traumatic amputations. The catalogue of injuries read like a medical textbook. Every type of trauma imaginable inflicted on thousands of people simultaneously. The hospitals that were still functional were overwhelmed within hours. Makeshift hospitals were established in schools, in churches, in any building with a roof and walls. Surgeries were performed under improvised conditions by doctors working 20-hour shifts. And then there was the cold. The blizzard arrived on December 7th, the day after the explosion, as if the universe had decided that Halifax hadn't suffered enough. Heavy snow, driven by winds that made the temperature feel even colder than it was. The fires, at least, were extinguished by the snow. But the homeless, the thousands of people sheltering in damaged buildings or in the open, faced new dangers. Emergency shelters were established, but there weren't enough of them, not nearly enough. People crowded into whatever space was available. Families who'd lost everything huddled together for warmth. The injured, many of them unable to move, lay in buildings where snow drifted through broken windows and missing walls. Frostbite joined the list of medical concerns. The social response to the disaster revealed something about the character of Halifax and of Canadian society more broadly. There was no panic, no looting, no breakdown of social order. Class distinctions, which were very real in 1917, became temporarily irrelevant. The wealthy opened their homes to the poor. Business owners who'd lost their shops worked alongside laborers who'd lost their homes. Everyone was a survivor, everyone was a victim, and everyone worked together. This isn't to say there were no problems. Resources were scarce. Tensions arose about distribution of aid, about who got priority for housing or medical care. There were complaints about bureaucracy, about delays, about officials who seemed more concerned with procedures than with helping people. But these were minor notes in a larger story of remarkable cooperation and resilience. The reconstruction began almost immediately, even while rescue efforts were still ongoing. There was no time to wait for perfect plans or ideal conditions. Winter was here, people needed shelter, and the city needed to rebuild. Temporary housing was erected, basic structures that were drafty and cold, but better than nothing. Damaged buildings were shored up, made safe enough for temporary occupation. The railways, crucial for bringing in supplies, were restored to operation within days. The long-term reconstruction would take years. Entire neighborhoods needed to be rebuilt from scratch. The Hydrostone district, constructed to replace the destroyed Richmond neighborhood, was one of the first planned communities in Canada. Built with fire-resistant materials and designed with the lessons of the disaster in mind. It still exists today, a lasting legacy of the explosion. But reconstruction was more than just buildings. It was also about rebuilding lives, helping people who'd lost everything start over. Orphans, hundreds of them, children who'd lost both parents in the explosion, needed homes and care. The widows and widowers, suddenly single parents or alone entirely, needed support. The disabled, people who'd been injured so badly that they could no longer work, needed ongoing assistance. Relief committees were established to coordinate aid distribution. The Halifax Relief Commission, created by the Canadian government, had authority and funding to help survivors rebuild their lives. It provided financial assistance, housing support, medical care, and vocational training for those who could no longer do their previous jobs. The commission would operate for decades, helping survivors and their families long after the immediate crisis had passed. The disaster also prompted broader social changes. The explosion demonstrated the need for better emergency planning, for building codes that could withstand disasters, for social safety nets to help people in crisis. In this sense, Halifax became a model for disaster response, its hard-won lessons applied to future catastrophes. But statistics and policies can't capture what it was like to live through the aftermath, to be a survivor trying to rebuild in the ruins. Let's imagine you're one of them. You survived the explosion somehow, maybe because you were far enough from the waterfront, maybe because you were shielded by a building, maybe just through sheer chance. You're injured, probably, but alive. You've lost your home. You've lost friends, family, neighbors. The city you knew is gone, replaced by a nightmare landscape of rubble and fire. What do you do? Where do you even start? You look for your family first, obviously. You search through the ruins of your home, hoping to find survivors, dreading what you might find. You check the makeshift hospitals, the relief stations, asking if anyone has seen your wife, your children, your parents. You write names on lists posted at emergency centers, hoping someone else will add information, will tell you where your loved ones are or what happened to them. If you find them alive, there's relief, but it's complicated by the reality of your situation. You're homeless, you're probably injured. You have no money, no possessions, nothing but what you're wearing, and that's probably torn and bloody. You need shelter, food, medical care, and there are thousands of other people who need the same things. If you don't find them, if they're among the dead or missing, there's a different kind of pain, a grief mixed with uncertainty. Bodies are being recovered from the ruins, but many are unidentifiable, burned or crushed beyond recognition. Mass graves are being prepared because there's no time and no resources for individual funerals, not for nearly 2,000 people. You might never know for certain what happened to your family, might spend the rest of your life wondering if they suffered, if they died quickly, if they knew what was happening. You need to think about survival, about practical concerns, even while you're processing trauma and grief. Where will you sleep tonight? What will you eat? How will you keep warm when the temperature drops below freezing? These aren't abstract questions. They're immediate and urgent. You join the crowds at relief stations, waiting for food distribution, for blanket distribution, for any kind of help. You're one of thousands, and the relief workers are doing their best, but they're overwhelmed. You wait for hours, cold and tired and hurt, just to receive a loaf of bread and a thin blanket. It's not enough, but it's something. You might find shelter in one of the emergency facilities, a church or school converted to house the homeless. You sleep on the floor, crowded together with strangers. No privacy, no comfort, just a roof over your head and a tiny bit of warmth from the press of bodies. You listen to people crying in the dark, calling out for lost family members, and you try not to think about tomorrow. Or maybe you're taken in by someone, a stranger who still has a home and is willing to share it. This was common in the aftermath, Haligonians opening their doors to people they'd never met, understanding that it could just as easily have been them who lost everything. You sleep on their sofa or on blankets on the floor, grateful beyond words, and you try to repay their kindness by helping however you can. The days blur together. You help with rescue efforts if you're able, pulling at rubble with bare hands, listening for sounds that might indicate someone trapped underneath. You find bodies mostly, and you help carry them to the collection points, trying to treat the dead with dignity even as you're surrounded by horror. You see things that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Children's bodies, whole families crushed together. Injuries so terrible that you can't believe anyone could survive them, though some people do. You see acts of kindness that restore your faith in humanity. People sharing food they can't spare. Doctors working until they collapse. Soldiers carrying injured people through the snow. Slowly, painfully, the city begins to function again. Shops reopen, those that can. Businesses start operating, sometimes from temporary locations. People return to work, those who still have jobs and workplaces. Life doesn't return to normal, because normal is gone, but it returns to something, some new version of existence that incorporates the disaster into its fabric. You start to think about rebuilding, about the future. The Relief Commission helps. There's financial assistance, not much, but enough to start over. There are programs to help people find new housing, new employment, If you were injured badly, if you lost your sight or a limb, there's training for new types of work, help adapting to your new limitations. You learn to live with the memories, with the nightmares, with the way your heart races every time you hear a loud noise. What we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't understood in 1917, wasn't treated, wasn't even really acknowledged. You just had to cope, to push through, to keep living because the alternative was to give up. And you'd survive too much to give up now. Years pass. Halifax rebuilds, literally and figuratively. New buildings rise where old ones stood. The scars fade, though they never disappear entirely. You rebuild your life, find a new home, maybe remarry if you lost a spouse. Try to create some kind of future out of the wreckage of the past. But you never forget. December 6th, 1917 is burned into your memory. You remember where you were when the explosion happened, what you lost, how the city looked in the aftermath. You tell your children about it, and eventually your grandchildren, and the story becomes part of your family's history, part of their identity. The Halifax explosion killed nearly 2,000 people and injured 9,000 more, but it didn't kill the city. Halifax survived, rebuilt, continued. The people who lived through it demonstrated a resilience that's difficult to fully comprehend from a comfortable distance. They faced impossible circumstances and somehow found the strength to continue, to rebuild, to create futures for themselves and their descendants. This is the final lesson of the Halifax explosion, perhaps the most important one. Disasters, even catastrophic ones, don't have to be endings. They can be terrible, traumatic transitions, but human beings have a remarkable capacity to endure, to adapt, to rebuild. We're fragile in the face of explosive forces and falling debris, yes. Our bodies break easily, but our collective ability to respond to crisis, to help each other, to persist in the face of overwhelming difficulty, that's more durable than any building. Halifax in December 1917 was a city that should have died. By any reasonable assessment, the disaster should have been too much, the damage too severe, the loss too overwhelming, but it wasn't. The city survived because the people who lived there decided to survive, decided to help each other survive, decided that the disaster wouldn't be the end of their story. And so Halifax rebuilt, and life continued. And the story of the explosion became part of the city's identity, a reminder of both terrible vulnerability and remarkable strength. The dead were mourned, their names recorded and remembered. The survivors carried on, creating new lives from the ruins of the old ones. And the city itself, that collection of buildings and streets and neighborhoods, rose again from the rubble. The Halifax explosion was a catastrophe, one of the worst disasters in Canadian history, but it was also a story of human resilience, of communities coming together in crisis, of people who refused to let tragedy define them. That's worth remembering alongside the horror and the loss. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well.